The UK economy suffered unexpectedly in January, with hospitality taking the brunt of the pain, according to the BBC. The figures suggest the Labour government doesn't understand how poor the vast majority of the population has become as a result of more than a decade of austerity and deprivation. And it means the entire country is vulnerable to shocks caused by the current war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. The key figure in the report is a 2.7% fall in food and drink service activities. Eating out is one of the first things households cut when money is tight. It is not a necessity, it is discretionary spending. When disposable income shrinks, restaurants, pubs, and cafes feel it immediately. That is the reason the WHIP line has been using hospitality as a reference point for the economy as a whole. January is a particularly sensitive month for structural reasons that policymakers and commentators sometimes gloss over. First, the post-Christmas financial hangover. Households typically carry higher credit card balances after December, and January is when those bills arrive. Even people who are normally comfortable tend to tighten spending temporarily. Second, the cost of living squeeze never really ended. Even though inflation has slowed from its peak, prices remain far higher than before it surged. Food, energy, rent, and mortgages all still take up a larger share of household income than they did a few years ago. Real disposable income for many households has never recovered. Third, interest rates remain high by recent historical standards. Higher mortgage repayments and rent increases leave less room for discretionary spending. The article itself notes that expectations of interest rate cuts have weakened, which pushes mortgage costs up further. Fourth, there is consumer caution. The BBC piece acknowledges that people were already worried about possible tax rises and unemployment. When households feel uncertain, they save rather than spend. Put all that together, and the January outcome is not particularly mysterious. In fact, the monthly GDP chart the BBC included shows that the economy has been bumping along around zero growth for 2 years. The pattern is tiny rises followed by tiny falls, and that suggests a structurally weak economy rather than a sudden shock. The BBC narrative leans heavily on the Iran war and energy shock, but the article itself is about a weakness that was already present before that. The war will be a convenient explanation for future collapses because it externalizes the problem. But if Labour relies on that, it will be another example of the government misleading the population, and proposed solutions will be misleading too. The numbers actually suggest an economy where household spending power is constrained, growth is dependent on fragile consumer activity, and even small pressures quickly stall the economy. In other words, growth depends on what people spend with their disposable cash, and those people don't have any. It means the whole system is now extremely vulnerable due to the greed of successive governments since 2010 that sucked money out of the economy and away from the people who needed it in order to further enrich those who were already extremely wealthy. The political dimension is that the government's economic messaging tends to focus on inflation falling and growth forecasts, but voters experience the economy through their bank balances. Wages and benefits have not kept pace with the accumulated rise in prices since 2010, let alone 2021 to 23, so people will feel poorer even if inflation has slowed and some wages have risen faster than prices. January is always weak, but the persistent flatlining across many months suggests a deeper issue with household spending power. That an economy dependent on consumers who have no money cannot generate sustained growth. Sadly, the solution is the one thing the Labour government adamantly refuses to do: putting money back into ordinary households. When lower and middle income households receive additional income, they tend to spend it in the real economy rather than saving it. That spending circulates through local businesses and generates activity. Policies should include raising wages, especially the minimum wage, strengthening collective bargaining over wages, and reversing cuts to benefits that have suppressed the incomes of the poorest households. Restoring the real value of social security alone would immediately raise spending in local economies. A sensible government would address housing costs, which are among the largest drains on disposable income. High rents and mortgage payments remove spending power from the wider economy and concentrate it in asset markets. Large-scale social housing construction would reduce rents over time and create jobs immediately through construction activity. It is one of the few policies that both stimulates demand and expands productive capacity. But of course, adequate social housing, built where it is needed and priced affordably by local councils, has been forbidden since 1980. Public investment would be another pillar. The UK has chronically underinvested in infrastructure, transport, energy systems, and regional development. When government invests in these areas, it does not simply spend money, it creates work, raises productivity, and encourages private firms to invest alongside it. The stagnation shown in the GDP figures reflects years of weak investment across the economy by governments that wanted to relieve the super rich from paying taxes. The current Labour government is no different, with fiscal rules that forbid most investment. Energy costs need structural reform. High and volatile energy prices drain household budgets and raise business costs simultaneously. Expanding domestic renewable generation and improving home insulation reduces those costs permanently. That is an economic as much as an environmental policy. And the fiscal framework matters. Governments often behave as if reducing public debt quickly is the overriding goal. But when an economy is stagnant, prioritizing deficit reduction can actually make the situation worse because it removes spending from the system. The key measure is not simply the size of the deficit, but whether borrowing finances productive investment that grows the economy over time. Turning the situation around would mean shifting away from an approach focused on austerity and fiscal caution and toward one centered on raising household incomes, lowering structural costs, and investing in the country's productive capacity. The irony is that none of these ideas are particularly radical. They are essentially the policies that powered post-war economic growth in much of the developed world. What makes them seem unusual today is how far economic policy in the UK has drifted toward conserving the profits of the rich over the well-being of everybody else and ignoring broad-based economic expansion.